Hey there, everybody. Jerry, the East Coast Viking Hanley here with my good friend JP, Jonathan Pishner from Apex Counseling. Again, bringing you forward today's version of our broadcast, Next Steps. We have officially named it, by the way. So then we are working behind the scenes on getting it into the podcast format as well, which will release new episodes and old ones. But today's is a big one we've been looking forward to for a while, and that is the power of stories. Like I mentioned in the caption briefly, a lot of us tend to think of stories as fictional, like smaller pieces such as books, comic books, movie scripts, and plots. But really, some of the biggest stories, and not the biggest stories, I'm going to say, are the ones that we really tell ourselves each and every day, guiding our decisions and the ways we feel about things. So I'm going to let JP take it off. We've already been talking about how excited he is on this one too. So, my man, you're up.
Yeah, this is a topic that is deeply important to not only my work, but I really wish people understood it more. So hopefully I don't go off on too many tangents today. But one of the things about stories is, as we examine our thoughts, most people don't realize they think in stories. We all think in terms of stories. And as a matter of fact, a wonderful example of that is Jerry, the tagline for your gym, Viking Performance Training, is make your ancestors proud. Now, what's interesting about that is that's a single sentence, but it suggests a story. It suggests your ancestors viewing you from on top of a cloud or wherever and smiling down at your actions or sternly judging them. So that single sentence, even though you're not sitting down and saying, oh, once upon a time, it suggests a story, and a human being cannot help but think of some version of that story by being exposed to that single thought. So, as a good advertisement for what happens behind the scenes in our brains, this happens everywhere and all the time. We think in stories, and so one of the things that is massively valuable to people is being able to know what stories you have conjured up inside of your head, what stories you need to change or shift or improve or fix, and which ones you can more or less leave alone. But that's going to be the focus of today's topic. And of course, like I always do, I'm like, oh yes, you just changed the stories, that you tell yourself. But that's such a ridiculously difficult thing to do. But hopefully, we'll provide at least a few ideas for that today.
Something that I think is fascinating about this is, I mean, I am a nerd in several senses of the word, and I've been aware of this since before I can even remember. I have like the details, the story, etc., the plot are always been changing, but I have a set like mental character of myself or caricature of myself or my hero, if you will, or just my protagonist is like who has been the protagonist in my like thoughts or daydreams since I mean like literally before I can remember. I'm talking single digit ages at some point I developed this protagonist, and that has been that he is still the main character 30 plus years later,
Mhm.
like even as all these things change. So the stories change, but that character has remained the same character the whole time.
Yeah.
So at some point, I kind of always had this. So it's pretty cool to me, like this, to have learned more about this in recent years, like so how this basically influences, so like emotional states, personalities, how we, I mean, kind of how we push ourselves, drive ourselves, or back away from things. Like to see how much about that, like how much of that is kind of tied into just that overarching long term sense.
Yeah. Well, and the main thing that's interesting about what you just said is everyone has that. Most people aren't consciously aware of the character that they have created for themselves that they're trying to live up to. You apparently became consciously aware of it extremely early. Most people carry it, they just carry it unconsciously, which maybe that's even a topic for one day is how to work on, changing that character in advantageous ways. Because since we think in stories, if we are not close to the hero that we have created in our minds and the protagonist of our story, we tend to feel bad. So the further you are away from that ideal image of yourself you created, the worse you'll feel. If you're pretty close to it, you tend to feel pretty good. Uh, and we craft that through our stories, through the stories that we're exposed to, through the stories, the passed down stories of our parents and our like our essential generational stories, the stories of our culture, all of this. So when you take these, or when you're creating this, you're creating it out of the amalgamation of the stories you have already been exposed to up to that point.
So, what do you think most people, or like, say, when people are first starting to create these stories? This is a developmental thing that happens from the beginning. I feel like, but again, it changes as reflections of your life and the thought you're giving to it. What do you feel is the kind of intuitive drive that most people are looking to reach with the stories that they create?
So this is actually addressed by some developmental psychology, but the very first story that you're crafting information around is whether or not you can be safe in the world.
Mm.
And sadly, that story has to be primarily crafted only by your parents. And if your parents are not very good at their job, you will easily craft a story that you are not safe in the world, which then very obviously leaves you vulnerable to a great many more problems and traumas later. But that's the very first story. Can I be safe in the world? If you're well cared for, it is very easy to come up with the idea that yes, I can be safe in the world. If you are inconsistently cared for, then the answer to that becomes a maybe. And if you're not well cared for, the story becomes I cannot be safe in the world. Because what happens next is, since that becomes the story at age 2 or 3, well, then you start having a child who has problem behaviors already, who maybe lashes out or maybe does other things that essentially drive people to treat them less well, which then reinforces the idea, well, see, nobody likes me. I cannot possibly be safe in the world. So the story is being crafted from the moment of birth, if not before. You actually have enough of a working brain to start recording information in utero. So I mean, you can start crafting stories then based off of the physical stimuli you receive.
Wow. Okay, that's nuts. Think about that. That's crazy. So, taking through like one of the ones that seems to make sense to me more so is that a lot of times people also use them for a sense of connection. That's like whether it's for the people around them, but then maybe also through, hence like the "Make Your Ancestors Proud" tagline, for example, maybe almost like a place of where they belong in almost in like time and space, like something like that. So I feel like belonging or connecting to the people around them in society, and then their belonging. A classic life is what is life or whatever, but maybe toned down just across just a time and space, like they're in human existence. Like, is am I kind of like hitting the right spot with what developmental scientists have found is like places?
So you used a confusing phrasing in your question, which is we use them to connect with other people. Do you mean use stories to connect with other people, or what are you saying?
I mean, like our internal stories to kind of think of like almost like we're coming up with what might be shared experiences or shared goals before shared opinions, shared thoughts of how the world works as we're being developed before we've even necessarily seen these things. I feel.
Yeah. That's actually I'm going to skip ahead many years to tell a couple of stories here in a minute. But the stories that you start with shape what you have available to you in terms of being able to connect with people by essentially the common story of your life. So like one of the reasons that you and I connected so well was because a lot of our internal stories are the same. Our internal stories based on values of things like, hard work and wanting to succeed and wanting to be good at what we do. Somewhere along the way, both of us valued the story of, you know, each of us being our own hero in our own story, valued the story of a hero who becomes very good at their craft, which allowed us to form a connection. Now, let's rewind all the way back to childhood for somebody for a second. Let's say somebody is not given the opportunity, and the developmental stage for this is in the single digits. I forget exactly where it is. That's one of those things I usually have to look up. But let's call it 6 to 8 or so. That's when they start to formulate the parts of the story around, can I be good at a thing, or do I like to try things, or do I like to notice that I'm good at things? If they're not given the opportunity for that, then different versions of hard work, or different versions of the value of being good at something, you don't get added to the story. And then you end up with a child who grows up with a much different set of stories inside of their head. And that usually ends up having to be corrected much later, either through just life experience, because life will smack you around if you're not good at enough things, or sometimes they come to me. This is one of the reasons we're going to talk about this today, is because of the stories that we have to retrain for people. So if we stick with this for a second, I do and have worked with a fair number of people who have the story that it doesn't matter what I do, I'm not going to get ahead, or it doesn't matter what I do, I'm not going to get the life I want. And that lets me know immediately, before I ask them literally any other questions, that they were exposed to a lot of, just experiences where the story became, I'm helpless. It doesn't matter what I do. This is very common for school children who aren't particularly good at school. If we take a child and we sit them in a place that they are maybe just not well designed for genetically, maybe the information is not well presented, maybe they just have unskilled teachers, and we put them through 12 years of them really having to work their butt off to get high F's and low D's. Well, how are we not going to end up with the story then of, it doesn't matter what I do, I'll never be good at anything? Like that's the only story you can reasonably come up with.
I didn't think about this specific of an instance until that very last sentence. But have you seen like the cartoon? I want to say it's a Far Side cartoon, but maybe not. But it's like about teaching, and it just mentions like grading students on a test, but it's animals, and it's basically on, say, their ability to climb a tree, but it's got a monkey, an elephant, a fish, or something, and like it's talking about grading them on that. Like before, like what I mean, so that is definitely, like, school is definitely one of the biggest ways we all develop these stories after our parents to start off. And so when you see those types of things, like they're just not fitting into that quote unquote ideal high performer story that you get in school so often, what are some of the like easiest ways to start, like, say, a parent or a family member or just somebody who maybe like works with kids like I do, just like what are ways we can work to basically balance those stories in like all kids' favors?
Okay, so you have now asked a question that is at the entire crux of the issue. So I'm going to do my best to organize myself and not just rant and rave, because this is the important thing. If you skip all the rest of the broadcast, listen to this part. Being able to imagine is the most important part of stories. So and this goes into both fictional stories and non-fictional stories. One of the most valuable things that you can give is the ability to imagine that I can do it. Matter of fact, one of the things that assign clients often is to find that literal thing. Without naming names or getting too specific, I'm working with somebody who is having difficulty imagining that they could be successful at their present educational level.
Okay.
And I said, well, okay, tell me about the people you're around. And it turns out that they are only around people who have education levels higher. They don't have any friends who are successful or who are doing well in life who have an education level similar to them. And the more I probed, the more I was like, wow, you literally have no stories in your head of somebody who is at the same education level as you, but is doing well. The homework became go find those stories. And the nice thing is, the ability to now imagine things has expanded and exploded a great deal with the internet. You hear me bitch about the internet all of the time and all of the negative emotional and mental consequences that comes with it. But here we have massive benefit because it takes no work at all to go and find not only the crazy outliers who have okay, this person has the same education level and became a billionaire. That's an outlier. That's not really. But you can get access to 100, 200, 500 stories of somebody who has this education level and still became successful and was a perfectly financially viable person and had a good life and everything. But if a person doesn't have access to those stories, they have real trouble being able to then imagine it, which if you can't imagine as possible, why the hell would you ever bother trying? And I've done this, this was an education level, but we do the same thing with social anxiety. A lot of people have trouble imagining that they can be okay with social anxiety. And the first thing we start doing is go find the stories. But I want to make sure to split it off and say something about fictional stories too. Finding non-fictional stories is good. And is often necessary when people get really upset about it. But fictional stories are valuable too, because fictional stories allow us to imagine solving the problem. Still, we know it's not real, but it still gives us puts into our imagination the ability to solve a problem. I'm going to point out one of the things I love about one particular book series, the Harry Potter series, is it provides the opportunity for almost every single type of person to imagine themselves in the hero role. And here's why. It has every type of hero you could ever want. It has brawny heroes. It has smart heroes. It has heroes who are unlikely heroes. It has heroes who have suffered. It has tragic heroes. Everybody. If I take 3 minutes and point out several, Harry is the grit and determination hero. If you read, and I'm talking about the books, not the movies. The movies leave a lot of stuff out. But Harry is the grit and determination hero, right? Mm-hmm. Ron is the unlikely hero. Ron, I mean, he didn't really want to be there. Now, it's sometimes hard to imagine yourself having a lot of determination, but it's pretty easy to imagine yourself as the dude who just stumbled into it and is like, crap, I don't want to be here, but now I'm stuck with being in this situation. Who can't imagine that? Who can't imagine for a moment being in that role? You got the smart hero. There's plenty of people who, are really kind of suck at physical stuff, but could imagine themselves being the smart hero. You've got, and really, who my favorite one out of the whole thing is? Snape. Snape is my very favorite hero out of all of them. Because even if you can't imagine, being any of the others, Snape is the guile hero. His only thing, he couldn't fight anybody. He couldn't reveal even what his intentions were. All he could do was do a thing here and there. He passed a little information here and just kind of screwed up 10% of a plan here. But you remove him from that story and the heroes lose. Every single hero was important, and every almost every hero you could ever hope to see was represented. That's why I love those stories, because no matter who you are, you can read that and say, "Oh, I can be in a hero role. If I'm not Harry, I'm somebody in these books."
Man, I feel like there's so many like variations of this because there are, and one of the things I was thinking about fiction, as you said, it was like how well it could be done. Because I know I personally, for example, like fiction is where I got most of my probably ideals for a very long time
Mhm.
until I started getting just more real world experience, whether it was through like, just through the school system, through growing up, like career wise, eventually owning the thing. And like I said, it didn't matter, whether it was books, movies, even video games that had good storylines. I would, collect individual ideals from it. And even thinking, like since it's older, but also back at the forefront a little bit right now, like say Tolkien, you mentioned, Harry Potter, his was a much more black and white ideal. And that's been said like countless times. He had, he was I mean, just more a product of the 1910s, 20s, 30s. Like, he want like when he did that, he was kind of specifically going for a more black and white, good and evil type of ideal. He didn't
Mhm.
have as many gray areas. But even then, you kind of still have that. Like Aragorn was supposed to be. I mean, the human ideal, but was also in essence a sense of like perfection that couldn't be attained. Whereas Boromir was the flawed hero who still comes and makes like basically like messes up, screws up,
Mhm.
has strengths but also insecurities and like from all that. And he makes classic huge mistake, still basically manages to have his moment when he atones and protects the hobbits right before he dies. But yeah, like even in terms of like fantasy races, like you said with types, I never thought about it till you pointed it out that way. I'd only thought or come across the Aragorn Boromir example,
Mhm.
but you have Gollum, who in many ways is like kind of like so like the I don't even know what you'd call him, but yeah, like
Oh, he is the tragic hero of tragic heroes. Like,
that's all I was gonna say. Like I didn't even know if he was like, yeah, like I thought he was almost too tragic for that. So yeah, like that. And then the other types, like I said, you have your dwarf, your short, stocky, more physical hero. You have your so thinking about this, so that's actually one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, I'm most familiar, and I feel like a lot of people would be too, but I could be wrong, in the hero's journey and the tragic hero. Like those are the two that I feel like get the most talked about, are just more well-known ones. But what are like some of the other, we can go into those briefly, but then also what are some other maybe common stories that like may come up with people quite frequently that you can like help people get the most out of it or change it?
uh, I mean, the stories that people come up with are as many as the number of people. Like, because the so, but if you're asking, you know, to kind of like categorize them, I mean, certainly one of the things you end up with most is the story of, I won't be able to dot dot dot, like, fill in the blank, but somehow I am ineffective in the world. I'm helpless in the world. That story is the one that comes up all of the time in the counseling room, and the story we're always fighting against. Uh, and of course, I'm exposed to many more negative stories for people, because that's literally what they bring to me and say, "Please
Well,
fix this story."
let me kind of add this little specific case here. So the hero's journey is in essence, because I know I'll probably butcher the exact thing, but it's again the hero basically either embarks on a journey or gets some form of or gets pushed onto a journey, one or the other.
Mhm.
They, like they have a goal, and maybe one that's theirs, someone else's, or a problem to solve. And at some point in time, they find obstacles and challenges which generally make them feel like they're lost and about to quit.
Mhm.
And then that is when they either find, that that they're stronger than they think. They learn something new. They meet new people, which help them overcome the challenges. Again, lots of different tools, and then eventually they succeed in this quest and journey that they're on. And as part of the whole thing is they realize they're a different, more successful person, whatever it is. And now, how often do you find that, like, when people come at you with more negative self stories, it is that they are stuck in that period of the hero's journey where things are just like, where it's just things are challenging, it's hard, and it may even look impossible.
Yeah, so I've never really thought about it like that. Give me a second to think about that. Because I would think that it's slightly more complicated than that because in a way everybody's on at least 4 or 5 journeys in their life because you've got your work/career journey, which may be different than your love relationship journey, right? Which may be different than uh, several other things in your life. So I would say that probably if we characterize people as being on a few different journeys in their life, the thing you were saying is right. Like that they're at the one of the problem stages, either that first set of challenges, or if you're going to quote Joseph Campbell, you got the inmost cave, which is meant to be the really toughest challenge, and they don't know how to get through it, don't believe they can, or there are every once in a while some people who are so close to being through it that they actually just need to be told, like, no, actually you're doing it right, and you just got to push a little further, and eventually it'll turn. But they've been doing it for a while, and so they uh, get discouraged. So we get this a lot with job stuff, where people are like, hey, I've been applying to jobs for 6 months, I can't get anything. And you evaluate what they're doing, and they're really doing everything right. They're networking, and they're putting out resumes, and it just so happens the circumstances haven't yet turned in their favor. Uh, so sometimes people come with that story, and they actually just need to hear, you're doing it right, stay the course, and eventually you'll break through. But then, yeah, the rest of them either get stuck in, I can't, because they tried a bunch of stuff and it didn't work, or they still believe they can. They're just lost on what the next action step is.
Okay, well, perfect. Because yeah, we've been talking a lot about theory and ways to kind of framework this. But yeah, let's go right into action steps now. Where yeah, how can we use these store, like, so, and start right where you're at, like when you have these clients, or again just people, because like just anybody comes up to these I can't stories, like, this isn't working situations. What can they do to really start thinking about their situation a little bit more and the choices that they do have?
Number one, the homework I already assigned. Find the stories of people who are where you want to be, and find the stories of people who are where you want to be and had to face similar challenges. I hate that our ideal of business success, let's say, I hate that it's people like Zuckerberg or Bezos or Musk, because those stories don't apply to most people. Like, how many people struggling with success whose parents owned an emerald mine, and got to start off with pretty massive networks? Like that story doesn't apply. I love the stories of people like Harlan Sanders, who had to try 77 freaking jobs and started his fried chicken. And for those who don't know, Harlan Sanders started Kentucky Fried Chicken and became a billionaire late in his life. But
Yeah,
I
he
mean,
was like
he,
65 years old.
yeah, he did everything. And finally, the wheel turned in his favor. But most people don't know that story. They know about a dude who wrote a computer program in his dorm room at 19 and was a billionaire by 22 or 23, whenever Zuckerberg made all of his money. Uh, and so people come up with, oh, that's the story, and I've missed my window. I'm out. So point number one, action step number one is find the stories of people who are where you want to be and who, and the internet makes this possible, and who had to struggle like through similar, you'll never find the same, but similar stuff. Same thing with Pemberton, the guy who created Coca-Cola. He was a pharmacist. He was just tinkering around in his back room,
Mm.
uh, and made something and was like, huh, I want, and I mean, so here's the story of somebody who was just working a regular job and was looking for something more and stumbled into something. Now that's something we can connect with because, like, okay, I can work my job and have a little side hustle and maybe see if it'll work. Probably won't work first shot like his did, but I mean, that's a story people can connect with. Just working their regular job and then trying something.
Couple good ones. Just to I'll also add for people listening as they check this out are Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, I think is his name.
Oh yeah, somebody brought that up when I was one of my clients brought this up. I still haven't read that. I got to read
Yeah,
that.
like it's really exciting because a lot of these stories we don't know unless we do go find them. Like just like you're saying, like we think of Nike now. Nike's been huge as long as most of us have been alive. Or
Yeah, like Nike was what you wanted to wear when I was
yeah,
8 years old.
right. But like the 20 years or so preceding Nike becoming Nike is an awesome story. Actually, really good. Another one, little bit more contemporary, is Delivering Happiness by I can't. It's like Tony Show or something like that. The guy who founded Zappos. Um,
Oh, okay.
he actually unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But like again, that book is really good. And even like not business wise, but a lot of these things are stories that are get used they get used or brought up for a reason. Like in athletics, most people know that Michael Jordan got cut from his high school team, from example, or like for like when he first tried out. That's like a common story in athletics that can be used as like a hey, he wasn't always Michael Jordan. He went through this. He went through this like this very common experience of being cut from a high school team or not making
Hmm.
varsity. There's millions of steps. Like that's something I hate where you're talking about people like I said, like with the business examples. I hate when people almost make it too simple. Like, oh, like Michael Jordan did it, so he got cut, but then he became the greatest. Like there was a lot in that. There's a lot in that journey in between, but at least they had that very common like failure that so many people just latch onto. Like so many,
Yeah.
how many kids out there, or adults when they were there, didn't make a team, and that was it, or they quit it.
What and let's talk about that for a second because man, I have counseled that person like 80 times by now. The person who oh gosh, we want to talk about stories getting stuck in your head and it being a little uncontrollable how you receive your stories. Uh, if you take a relatively bright kid and stick them in the school system, they will win and win and win and win and win and win and maybe win all the way up through undergrad. And eventually, they are going to be exposed to a failure for themselves. And one of the problems that people run into very, very frequently, and the story that ends up in their head, is they've won their entire life. Most of the people around them, especially you go places like med school or something, most of the people around them have won their entire life. If they're the first one that gets an F on the test, it's devastating to them because the story that has accidentally gotten into their head, not on purpose, nobody meant to do this, but the story that accidentally got in their head was that uh, you must always win at everything, and your peers are always winning at everything, and therefore now that you have gotten the F, you are now behind, and you are now a miserable loser because the only people you can think of who you ever got Fs are the ones who failed out of school, right? Because we don't easily notice those middle people. Uh, so the story that got in that gets in that person's head is they're a wreck. And then it's even worse because the story that they've been exposed to is, oh, you have to do all of this just through hard work and brute force. The story I have to expose people to all of the time, med students especially, law students a lot, and grad students in general a lot, is that you can do school without brute forcing everything and living on 2 hours of sleep and bad nutrition and taking drugs like Adderall. But those stories don't get told too much because the stories of people brute forcing it are glorified not only by peers, but oftentimes by professors. And so that story infects a lot of people. And then, since they've never been exposed to an alternative narrative, especially one they can view as realistic, they're terrified that they have this double bind of, well, I can either live this horrifyingly stressful life that I can already tell is doing damage to my body,
Yep.
or I can be a loser and quit, which, by the way, if you quit, you're not a loser, but that's the story that's in most people's heads. And so they end up in this terribly stressful double bind. And so my job then ends up becoming trying to expose them to a lot more stories than they have been previously exposed to, and opening up that imagination.
And another place that this is very valuable is for people who, a lot of people, when they want to make a change or they want to start working on a goal, they look for that almost like a perfect no quarter given type of plan. And, so it's not their story starting off with, like in these situations you're talking about, but let's say the person who wants to embark on losing weight and getting healthier. They try to find a perfect plan, a perfect diet, a perfect workout plan. And if, let's say they start on Monday, because that's classic start of everything healthy day. And, Tuesday afternoon, they
And
mess
January 1st, too.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, Tuesday afternoon or day 3 or something, they miss something goes wrong. There's so many people have that automatic thought of like, I didn't perfectly follow this plan. I'm going to have to start over, or I'm going to have to fail. And so many people also kind of attach that to, and again, like we have those, we've talked about this before. We have these like automatic bookmarks in our head a lot. So rather than simply picking up the next meal or making sure you get to the gym the next day, you put it off for another smooth starting date. That we see that so often. Like, and I'm going to say too, with the only empirical evidence being myself, that and a few people I know, if I think about it, that the longer you are able to sustain like false perfection, the harder it is to start up again if you break off of it.
Yes. I a few minutes ago I complimented the internet. Now I'm going to rant and rave about how terrible the internet is. Uh, fitness specifically, but numerous other places in general, business and several others. Uh, People are exposed to a lot of false stories and a lot of stories that, if they're true, they're very unlikely. I hesitate to call everyone out there liars, but you know, there's a lot of them. The stories that a lot of people are exposed to, especially if they want to start, say, a fitness journey, is they'll be exposed to a very warped story, because they'll be like, oh, I'm going to say the influencer, the Instagram influencer that they finally find is going to say, yes, I had no success with fitness until I did this, and then they lay out the plan, and they leave out about 50 pieces of important information. Number one, they don't say how long it took for them to find a plan that fit them. They said, one sentence, I didn't experience any success until I did this. Back to your tagline. The sentence implies a story, right? Well, that sentence implies a story too. That sentence implies that, oh, well, I tried a few things and they didn't work out, and then I did this and it worked. It implies a very shortened timeline. Whereas what is probably accurate is that person tried 17 things over the course of 5 years before they found something that worked. assuming it's even an honest story. We don't even know it's an honest story, first off. Second, and then I started doing this, and everything became peaches and cream. But the part of the story that they imply, without saying directly, is that if you follow this plan perfectly, it will work. The part that is left out of the story is we have no idea if this plan fits this person's genetic makeup in such a way that it will have the same advantageous benefits. And so people end up with the false story of, oh, it's not working for me. I must be doing something wrong. They haven't even yet been exposed to the idea of maybe this is a wrong plan for me. I've tried ketosis. People swear how amazing it is. I lose 50% of my ability to think when I'm in ketosis. Period. And I do a thinking job, so I'm not doing that. That would be crazy. I have a diet that I'm on now that seems to work maximally well for my body and my brain, and it works. But I had to try 17 other things to get there. What's left out of the story so often is that part, the experimentation phase, and figuring out what works right for your body. So there's so many people who are exposed to these stories of success, but they're truncated and warped in certain ways that it causes people to fail to imagine that maybe this is the wrong story for their makeup. Like back, you said you read a lot of D&D books. I imagine you probably read like the Drizzt series by Salvatore.
I have every single one of them.
Okay, well, number one, you should. Number two, there's 5 heroes, and all of them are different. You have the stocky dwarf fighter that's basically a Gimli, XP, right. and then you have Legolas with swords, which is Drizzt. You can't have them swap fighting styles and make it work. Same way, most people don't even realize you can't swap diets between 2 different sets of genetics and expect them to work the same way. So rant concluded, but basically, yes, the stories people are exposed to around fitness and success end up getting warped in ways that are disadvantageous to them.
Well, so rant maybe not concluded, because I feel like with the problems a lot of people have, I feel like, and this can happen in any part of the story, is when they come up to situations where anything negative that happens, they internalize as being towards them or because of them. Anything positive that happens, they reflect as it being in spite of them almost, or not because of them. Like, I feel like, again, that's a very problematic set of things and leads to a lot of like depression, negativity, or just, or, like that, maybe even just simply a lack of confidence. But it's those things. Like, so in those cases, deflectors of the positive and like internalizers of the negative, what can those people start doing to start, like, I don't want to say fix, of course, that's not the best word, but to improve that, to see
it. So let's notice where that would have had to have come from. In the grand majority of cases, that frankly has to come from childhood, which means you're already fighting against quite a lot of story in your head. But the way that comes from childhood is if we imagine how such a story gets written. Like, okay, how do I say everything bad that happens is my fault and everything good that happens can't possibly be my fault? We have to be talking about a story of helplessness, a story of I cannot positively impact myself and the world around me in the way that I want to. Well, kind of hard to take an empowered 45-year-old and then get them to write a story of helplessness in their head. It's very hard to take an empowered person and change the story. You almost have to start out with the story of helplessness, which means stuff happened where basically you tried to improve your situation and learned through many experiments that you could not. And so if we imagine, oh, well, okay, let's say, maybe one of my parents was mean or something. Every time I did something, I was told it was my fault, and I got spanked or beat or grounded or who knows what. I've worked with clients who got punished over crazy nonsense for sure. So you get told, oh, everything is your fault. And then maybe parents actually do it, or maybe it's just by circumstance. But then how do you start imagining, uh, oh, well, I did well on this test. Would you start imagining it's because you did well, or would you imagine, well, I keep getting told that I suck, so maybe this isn't, maybe I just got lucky. And then that story repeats on and on for a long time. So I think step one, if I was going to now to finally get around to your question, which is what do people do? A recognition of where the story comes from is invaluable. Like if you examine and oftentimes you end up needing the assistance of a counselor, but if you're able to do it yourself, terrific. Examining, where did the story come from? Who gave me this story? Human beings don't easily create stories of helplessness out of thin air. We almost have to be given those stories by our parents or other family members or at school or something. We have to get them from somewhere. Where did I get my story of helplessness from? And step two would be like, okay, is there anywhere I can believe I have positively impacted my life? Because if you can believe it on one thing, you can start working to expand that. And some people, that the answer to that is no. They can't believe that they've positively impacted themselves in any way. But if you can believe, oh yeah, that's right. I do remember I passed this class, and I do remember I worked really hard, and I do remember that actually that was somehow all me. If you can break through it in one, you can break through it in more. And then you just look for the next thing. Like, okay, well, I've always thought this wasn't me. I did this positive thing. Oh, I got into med school. Um, and I always said, well, I got lucky, but well, maybe it really was that I wrote a great essay, and maybe it really was that my GRE score was, or well, for med school it's the MCAT. Maybe it really was that my MCAT score was terrific. So you can start trying to expand the story of positivity, but it is frankly quite hard if somebody is starting from the position of helplessness. A lot of the time, they're going to need the assistance of a professional just to get enough momentum to get going.
Is it? I mean, everybody's different. Always got to have that disclaimer. Is it somewhat accurate to say, based on what you just said, that it is almost easier for a person to start a new story than to change the story that they have been telling themselves?
Maybe if you would expand on what you mean by that.
Like almost easier to take an action, a moment, or something like that, and tell themselves, like, starting here or from this point on, or we're going to change and we're going to make something different, rather than trying to almost like make the way that they feel or act. Well, it's like, I guess
I see what you're saying.
trying to say like
I've got it now.
yeah, like using a separation of sorts to.
Yeah, I would say it's going to be different between different people. Some people will find it easier. So what he's asking is, um, basically, can somebody use a technique of saying, okay, I decide starting today, I am not going to continue to play out this story of helplessness. I decide starting today, I positively impact my life. Yes, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, back to fictional stories being valuable, right? We see that happen in some movies. We see somebody who, like, you know kind of wakes up and realizes that their life is a misery, and they say, I can't do this anymore. I have to turn it around right now. And because we have access to those stories, even in fictional format, it allows us to imagine such a thing. So yes, absolutely. Some people do that. Some people struggle with it. Almost since you kindly put in the disclaimer of everybody's different, everybody will connect to their own story differently, and thus they will connect to what changes they need made to their story differently. You and I have similar stories that we connect with, but Bob from accounting might connect with completely different stories. And so maybe he can't do the separation technique. Maybe he's got to have a whole different technique he uses to make his story work for him. But the thing you suggest is absolutely right and absolutely a thing that people can use. Yes.
Okay. When so something the thing I like. Okay, so you mentioned a couple times how finding examples of stories you like, the stories like people who've achieved the stories you like and have similar circumstances. How so that like you said, so awareness in a way or has to be that first step. But so how frequent, like what about frequency in terms like how frequently should most people actually try to think about this and almost as like reminders?
How frequently should people eat healthy?
So okay, I was actually basically hoping for that type of answer to see what it would be because like like it's I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. Like okay, I feel like looking at it as almost like habits or simple mindset. If you can break it down into small, like very small chunks, it usually is easier to digest and make it happen. So yeah, like I feel like it's the type of thing where if you can almost tell yourself to simply keep with something better, or like I said, like the better story that you may want to live, the positive changes that you're trying to create, and simply do it as a, I can do this for one day, or I can do this for one hour, like depending on what it is. But yeah, like those types of things can help people make those changes. Like
Yeah,
last,
yeah, and let me actually answer your question instead of just making a metaphor
yeah, I
like
feel
I
like
did.
too many people open ended, and then you end up with no real change because you don't really have a guide to it.
Well, yeah, yeah. So exposing yourself to helpful stories as much as humanly possible is really something that you should do as much as you can. Matter of fact, on the opposite end, there's a lot of stories that I deliberately avoid. So you'll see me avoid certain shows, for example, that other people like. But if they are too much like the stories I'm exposed to at work, that's no good for me because that overbalances. Because of course I take on a lot of negative stories, right? That overbalances things in my brain towards the negative. So when I watch movies, when I watch TV shows, you'll almost see me exposing myself deliberately to stories that are overwhelmingly positive. Yeah, they'll have, any story has drama, any story has negativity. It can't be a story otherwise. But you won't see me, watching something like to do a very old movie. I'll never watch Gone with the Wind again because it is a very well done story of a very toxic relationship that could have been fixed, but simply wasn't. And so it ends with them breaking up forever, and that's the end of the movie.
Hmm.
Well done movie. I'll never watch it again because I actually need in my entertainment to take on positive stories to balance out what I get in a workday. So for the person who's not exposed to that, it's a little easier, but the answer still becomes expose yourself to as much positivity in stories, both fictional and non-fictional, as you can stand, because that does have an absolute impact on your brain and on your
Yes.
wiring and on your imagination.
You just spoiled Gone with the Wind for me. I've never seen it.
I did not perceive you as somebody who was ever actually going to watch it, so I wasn't terrifically worried about it.
Probably accurate. It's funny as you were saying that, I was thinking because as of this moment in time, one of the most popular shows out there seems people talking about is Dahmer, the Netflix show on Jeffrey Dahmer, and yeah,
Mhm.
like or even right now, like this is it's been a pretty strong trend where shows on things like serial killers, people love watching that, true crime, and yeah, I'm like I don't have the negative stories that you do in terms of like hearing from people. But even then, I'm just like, this isn't something like again. I have nothing against people who are watching them for
Sure.
entertainment at all. But I'm like, this doesn't do it. This doesn't attract me because it's just like not interesting to me in a way of something that I want to get.
Well,
I love watching stories or hearing stories, reading stories of like retribution, achievement, things like that. Like I've always been very attracted to tragic heroes. Like even if it doesn't actually end up in tragedy, like I've always liked that type of, even if you feel like they generally feel like they've, even at like there's no coming back, they still end up doing the thing that they need to do or should have done at the end. So, but it's personal.
Well, and let's take a 5 minute aside into negative stories for a minute, because they are valuable. They're not valuable for allowing you to access what we're talking about, which is creating a better story for yourself. But they're still valuable because negative stories allow for a type of catharsis that we often miss out on in our lives. Because if you watch a negative story, so let's pick on Dahmer, right? I have never seen it, but my guess is that many of the people that it shows him doing something to, at least half of them are going to be not very nice people. Like maybe he does something to a grandma too, but like probably a lot of them aren't going to be people that we would like very much. And in a story situation, they'll end up being kind of a hate sink. Like, here's a person I don't like, and then we achieve catharsis when we see the killer get them. Because, there's that person I didn't like, and they got eliminated. That's not necessarily bad. It's just like any drug, it should be limited. Like, it's kind of like alcohol. Like, you can use alcohol safely. You can use a cathartic negative story safely. Matter of fact, my very favorite cathartic negative story is John Wick. You've probably watched John Wick.
Yeah.
Most people who like shooter movies have. That's an overwhelmingly negative story. But it is also a cathartic story. Like, here's somebody who we hated from the first second we met him, and then finally at the end of the movie he dies. The story, the negative story can be used for catharsis, but it should just be used cautiously and conscientiously. So yeah, you won't see me watching too many of those, but I do watch them sometimes, but not too terribly much, because I just know that it's not good to watch too many negative ones just because of the stories I'm exposed to. Same thing with video games. Matter of fact, let me yell at people who say violent video games cause violence. Violent video games are a drug that can be abused. Violent video games are also a way to achieve catharsis. Like, oh man, I don't want to get in my car and actually run over another human being, but if I do it in Grand Theft Auto, it's fine. Nobody got hurt. So it's the same thing. It's catharsis, but it can be overused and abused. But if used judiciously, that story gives us something. It gives us something relatively positive.
Mm-hmm. So the last thing I'm thinking about here is it's come up in previous broadcasts of ours in a way, but it's that sometimes in some stories you may be wrapped up in such a negative kind of atmosphere for your story, or almost a story world, for a term that may not exist, that the way you may need to get out is actually, or change your story, may have to be getting out of the story world. Toxic families is one we talked about, or toxic friend circles, but also it could be an actual community. Like let's look like kind of some issues where these things really happen. You have like say some gang communities where like you basically end up having two choices, and that's either join that type of lifestyle or live a short life or something like that, and especially I feel like a lot of times, granted, this is just like from what I've gathered, but a lot of times like those types of, like, some communities like that may not be particularly, not only not supportive, they may be actually against you changing the story there. Like they don't want to see people suddenly succeed the right way. So you may have to, like, your option may have to be leaving. Again, I chose pretty extreme examples on purpose, but this same type of thing may happen if it's a work environment. Again,
Dude, this same thing happens 7 miles down the road. You're absolutely right, because think of the story of Middle West Virginia. Even today in certain areas, but certainly 30, 40 years ago, uh, the community story was that you could, if you wanted to make anything yourself, you had to either work the coal mines or go in the military. That was the community story. And if you chose to do something else, if you moved to the big city, you did run the risk of being somewhat or completely excommunicated from the community. You weren't one of them anymore. So yeah, a community story absolutely exists. You do have it in inner city gang stuff. You've got it in rural areas. You've got it all over the place. And the thing you're speaking to is so wonderful, because I hadn't really thought of it to mention today. But yes, when you go against a group story, you do run the risk of being exiled or ostracized or even abused by that group. Uh, and you know, it's good you brought up family stuff, because of course one of the things that happens a lot is if you break the family story, they will oftentimes verbally tell you about it, often in abusive ways. So I think I saw this line from Denzel Washington on the internet, and it was something like, I'm gonna misquote it since I'm not looking it up right now, but something about uh, your family will absolutely hate to watch you break their generational traumas. This ain't for the weak.
Dang.
And that applies to everywhere that you're going to break the community story. They will hate it. And especially in those very rigid community stories. Healthy communities have flexible and adaptable stories. Unhealthy communities have very rigid stories in the way that you are saying. So my infinite empathy to anyone who is struggling with whether or not they should break the community story in order to live their own life, because that is a hard decision with some potentially very real consequences.
I'd say, like, almost as my homework is for people to go and see how many of those they're around, and maybe how many times that's running the show too, like in their life. I mean, like I said, and like, like a big one might be in rural areas. You might like, it's almost like a Hallmark movie, like Hallmark movies or Hallmark Christmas movies. Every single one of them is a community story because almost every single one of them is the city story going against somebody who goes to a more small town area and finds love, finds peace in a quieter lifestyle. You name it, whatever. Again, it's very simple. It's literally the same plot hundreds of times, but it's that can be a common one, and they're being created all the time in different groups, especially with social media, because you end up with it, like it's an. I feel like these days it's more of an echo chamber phenomenon. It, at least before, took longer for things like that to spread out or spread this messages to spread. Now it can happen in minutes. so like these things can happen very, very quickly. Um,
Yes.
so being aware of them, I feel like it can be key.
So I want to point out something on the personal level that I really always want people to be aware of, because when it comes to stories, one of the things that, unfortunately, for obvious reasons, that we can't get access to is how the story continues. So a lot of people struggle with, even if they live a reasonably good story. If we look at especially fiction, the thing that we see is at some point credits roll, and we no longer have access to anything after the story. And what that implies in the brain, since it ends on a high note, because you usually end the movies on a high note, is it implies a certain level of happily ever after. And it implies that The hard part of the story is over, and it should be all easy street after this. And I want to point out the mistake of that thinking, not because people intentionally think that, but it's what we accidentally get programmed for. And I want to bring up my favorite subversion of that, and what to my mind is the best piece of fiction that demonstrates real world human success. And you might actually guess it, but most people don't guess it until I tell them, and then they look at me like I'm crazy. The Rocky movies. That is the greatest work of fiction that shows real, honest to God human success that I have ever seen in my life. And the reason for that is this, and I'm going to eliminate the propaganda movie, Rocky IV, where he ends the Cold War by winning a boxing match. But like all of the other ones, if we track success and opportunity and failure and struggle and his own demons, we see somebody who, maybe they once had a shot and maybe they didn't, but they clearly didn't pursue it and whatever. And so he's just kind of doing some stuff, and he's living a life that is clearly not terrifically satisfying. And he gets an opportunity. Well, and for whatever reason, this time he takes the opportunity. And he gets to go fight the champ of the world. And he loses. Which, by the way, lots of spoilers coming for the Rocky movies, by the way. So sorry if you didn't see the first one. But so he loses. But he makes something out of that, and he makes some money and everything. And we see him at the beginning of the second movie, and we would get to watch him literally squander that success. But then he spent all the money, and he didn't realize that you needed to actually like invest it and do things. And so by the middle of the movie, he's pretty much right back where he started. Perfect start to a human success story. And then he gets another opportunity, and he's about to not take it, but then he does. He takes the opportunity, but a lot of people wouldn't, and a lot of people would almost throw it away. And then that time he actually wins. And then we get to see him win the championship. And then at the third movie, what does he do? He screws it all up again. And you see that up and down and up and down and up and down. And it's so perfectly done. That is exactly how human beings behave. So I tell you all of this because I want you to have access to a story. I have access to a lot of stories, right? I actually kind of cheat when it comes to knowing what's possible because I get the inside look at hundreds of people's lives. But that is how real human beings do success, is they get something and maybe they make it work, or maybe they screw it up. And then they get something again and they screw it up, but in a different way. And then they get something again and they avoided those first two mistakes, but then they managed to screw it up in yet a different way. That is real world. And so if you are living that story, the thing I would encourage you to know is that is not a story of how much you suck. That is a story of, oh, you're making new mistakes instead of the old ones. Well, okay, you're actually doing pretty okay. The swings suck, but just keep pressing. That's the point of that story.
It's a story of then taking the next step. Exactly. Yep, right there. All right, man. Anything else you would like? You want to bullet point this, or anything else you want to add?
I couldn't even hope to bullet point this, but I will say that for people looking for positive stories, I didn't notice this until it was pointed out to me. But for the purpose of having access to stories that are positive, I'll point out what was once pointed out to me. So Star Trek is actually a surprisingly positive story. Not because of what you see in each episode, but because the entire background of Star Trek, the way they start each episode, the starting position that I now love every single time I watch it, is the story of what could we look like if we got it right. What could humanity look like if we actually eliminated war and most crime, and we actually everybody had the opportunity to contribute, and our society was based off of service instead of how much could you get? Like, it's one version of what would we look like if we got it right. And I love that starting position because it's non-cynical. So For anybody looking for other positive stories to expose yourself to, I now look at Star Trek through that lens, and I enjoy the show much more.
Ooh, I did not see that coming. So that was a good one. Yeah. I was trying to think. I was like, Star Trek. I was like, the background is going to be because it's
Well,
space.
and like I said, somebody had to point it out to me, but as soon as they said it, I was like,
Yeah.
oh my God, this is no wonder people love this. This is so unique because every other sci-fi is dystopian. Like, look how horrible humanity becomes. Star Trek is the only one that proposes maybe we got it right.
That's awesome. All right, man. Well, yeah, appreciated spending this afternoon with you for a while.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you guys for sticking around and listening. If you listen to the whole thing, hopefully you make something of it.
Exactly. So yeah, I said give this a listen to, share it with people you think of value, and we'll catch you guys later.
See y'all.